Hello and welcome to Hard Lens Media. My name is Kit Cabello and I'm joined here today with my co-host Eric Unger, and we have a special exclusive interview with journalist Ben Norton. Ben Norton, thank you so much for joining us today. For our viewers and subscribers, just so we have a general idea of who you are, can you please introduce yourself and also tell us why currently you are now in Venezuela?
Absolutely. I help edit an investigative journalism website called The Grayzone. That's the American spelling with an A. It's thegrayzone.com. And I edit that with Max Blumenthal. And it's an investigative journalism website focusing on U.S. foreign policy, the empire, everything that's going on around the world. And of course, social movements, the left, the crisis, political crisis and economic crisis we're all living through in the world. And I'm a journalist, obviously. I'm also a filmmaker, and I've been doing a lot of video reports here in Latin America since June, well, actually like half this year. So, of course, the Trump administration is really ratcheting up U.S. intervention in Latin America, targeting the progressive governments here, supporting the far-right governments. And right now I've been in Venezuela reporting on the effects of the U.S. embargo that was declared and the U.S. sanctions before that. And also in July, I was in Nicaragua, and in June, I was in Honduras. And in April and May, I was in Colombia, and in February and March, I was also in Venezuela again. So I've been doing a lot of reporting here this year, and we can talk about it. But the basic summary, of course, is that mainstream corporate media is largely ignoring what the U.S. is doing here in Latin America. It's not new. There's a legacy of 200 years of there's a legacy of hundreds of years of European colonialism, and then 200 years of U.S. colonialism in Latin America, going back to the Monroe Doctrine. And John Bolton, Donald Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, is now openly invoking the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine to refer to U.S. policy in Latin America. There's not much interest in mainstream corporate media, so we're here trying to break the media blockade on the actual blockade.
Right. So can you please explain to us a brief history of what led up to the U.S. wanting to overthrow Maduro in the first place? And where did Juan Guaido come from?
That's a good question. Juan Guaido, I will say, for people who don't know, is the U.S. appointed coup leader, and he is very young, in his 30s. And what's really interesting is that before he declared himself interim president of Venezuela in January of this year, 2019, more than 80% of Venezuelans had never heard of him. There was a poll done by one of the leading polling firms here in Venezuela. The polling was done in January, before he self-declared. And again, nearly more than 80% of Venezuelans didn't know who he was. So let's talk about who he is and what the U.S. has been doing in Venezuela. Of course, to understand what's really going on, you have to go back a really long time, right? But we don't have the time for that. So instead, let's go back to 1998, 1999. What happens is you have the rise of a leftist nationalist figure in Venezuelan politics who came from the military, but was very left-wing. His name was Hugo Chavez, of course. And Hugo Chavez was one of the most important leaders in Venezuelan history. He broke the two-party dictatorship, they call it, that dominated politics since Venezuela overthrew its dictatorship in 1958. So from 58 to 98, you had, like in the US, you basically had a two-party dictatorship where every year the two parties switch power and they implement most of the same policies. Hugo Chavez comes in with a new movement declaring a new republic. He wasn't calling himself even a socialist yet, but he was a nationalist. He was progressive oriented. He wanted to help the poor. And most importantly, he also wanted to control the oil reserves in Venezuela and use the money of those oil reserves to fund programs to help the poor and to build infrastructure and make social programs. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Mm-hmm. This point is so important to understand everything that's happening. It has the largest oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And that has been a blessing and a curse, because what it has meant these are problems that go back more than 100 years when oil was discovered. What it has meant is that this is very much a petrostate. It has been a petrostate well for decades before Hugo Chavez, before the rise of what they call the Bolivarian Revolution, this progressive socialist movement. And what that had meant is that in the past, you had these, corrupt neoliberal presidents who used the oil wealth to enrich their own political allies, their own companies, their own inner circle. And that was the way the country worked. He opened that up. He nationalized all of the multinational oil companies and said, we're going to use this to fight poverty, to fund healthcare, to build housing. And he did. And the United Nations recognized Venezuela's enormous accomplishments fighting poverty, building a very positive education system in a country that actually had large numbers of people who were illiterate, building huge numbers of houses, nearly 3 million, expanding the healthcare system, making it free. He did all of these things. But of course, one of the problems with Venezuela, again, going back 100 years, is that because it's a petrostate, it is largely relying on imports because most of the economy is built around oil production. So their model was just, we're just going to import food. We're going to import many of the things people need and want. So that, of course, made it in some ways unstable compared to other countries that have food sovereignty. Venezuela does not have food sovereignty. It does not produce all of its food. It produces only about half of its food. So that leads us more up to the current moment, right? Hugo Chavez, because he nationalized all of the oil companies and kicked out ExxonMobil, kicked out all these big, mostly US, but other multinational corporations, he, of course, was, very much angering the 1% in the US, the capitalists who want to get access to all of this. And Venezuela also has major natural resources. It has minerals, it has gold, and so many other things. They wanted access to that. Canadian companies, mining companies were really active here as well, not just US companies. So in 2002, there was a direct US-backed military coup against Hugo Chavez, who was the democratically elected leader. At that point, he had already won 2 elections and a referendum for the Constitution. So he had won three elections, really. The US helped overthrow him under George Bush, but Hugo Chavez was so popular that the masses of people took to the street and restored him to power. And then the revolution became more radical. He hadn't been a socialist, but he realized that the corporations that he kicked out were not going to let him govern, that capitalism actually wouldn't let democracy run here unless that democracy allows US corporations to control the politics and the economy. So he became more radical and became a socialist and began talking about 21st century socialism. And those were kind of the golden years where, like I said, even the United Nations and many international institutions recognized that Hugo Chavez drastically cut poverty, drastically increased literacy and education and all these things. Well, leading up finally to the moment we're in now, that all, there were so many accomplishments, but the fatal flaw, and I wouldn't say call it a fatal flaw because it's not fatal. The government is still in power. Chavismo is still a prominent movement. The Chavismo is the movement based on Hugo Chavez, and it's still very powerful in the country. But because for 100 years, Venezuela has been so reliant on oil, that was, again, a blessing and a curse. It allowed the government to fund all these programs to help the poor and make free housing for poor people. But at the same time, it meant that if the price of oil plummets, as it did, and we'll talk about oil politics later, then it really hurt the economy. So in the past, since 2014, there have been major economic problems in Venezuela. I mean, life, for the most part, is pretty normal. People portray it as a dystopia. I mean, I was just out today, I just got some lunch. I was on the metro. It's not much different from New York, where I'm from. But there are major economic issues, and we can talk about that. And, that's kind of a history of the Chavista movement. I know it was a pretty long answer, but there's so much more we could talk about. That's kind of the nutshell history. But it's important to understand, of course, that the U.S. is not interested in overthrowing Venezuela because it's supposedly a dictatorship. It's not. It's very much still a democracy.
Right.
And U.S. allies are actual dictatorships, like in Honduras, and they don't care about that. The thing is, Venezuela has significant natural resources and a leftist government. That is why the U.S. is interested in overthrowing the government.
Right. So, where did Juan Guaido come from? Where did he come into play?
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, I was trying to. You asked for a brief history, which is really hard to do.
That's perfectly fine.
Yeah. So Juan Guaido is an interesting character. Like I mentioned, he's very young and he's quite new to politics, but he's been involved in the right-wing opposition in Venezuela for a decade now. At the Grayzone, you can find me publish an article, a detailed investigation looking into the history. It's called The Making of Juan Guaido. And it shows that he has been cultivated by many of these U.S. government-funded right-wing groups going back well over a decade. Specifically, there was a group called Generation 2007, which was a group of right-wing activists. I mentioned that after the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez, which was temporarily successful, and then he was restored to power. Then he began radicalizing what he called the Bolivarian Revolution, which began as a progressive nationalist revolution and became a socialist revolution. And around that time, when he declared himself a socialist in 2006, and then he gave the famous UN speech in which he called George W. Bush the devil. And look, you can look that up on YouTube. It's so funny.
Wow.
He called George W. Bush the devil. Anyway, of course, this is the time of the Iraq War. This is the time of the war in Afghanistan. And I mean, the war in Afghanistan is still happening, but it was a really turbulent time, and a lot of things were changing in global politics. And the U.S., which had been triumphant after the World War, was being more and more belligerent and warmongering, and people were more and more realizing that this is an empire that doesn't care about international law. So Hugo Chavez comes onto the stage, and the U.S. begins training a lot of these right-wing activists who are going to try to topple the government in various ways. And there's this group called Generation 2007,
right?
And they were trained by different groups that go back to what they call the color revolutions in Eastern Europe, going back to Yugoslavia. There were all these groups that were made first by the CIA during the Cold War, and then after the end of the Cold War, they became all these NGOs that are kind of openly funded. It's still kind of secret, but more openly funded by groups from the US government, like the National Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the US Agency for International Development. These are the soft power arms of the US government. They fund a lot of these groups around the world that are trying to, fight against socialist governments, fight against revolutionary governments, and ultimately bring in a neoliberal government that will give large contracts to multinational corporations, that will take loans from the IMF, that will impose structural adjustment programs, that will cut social spending. I mean, it's part of the neoliberal consensus that has dominated the world since the end of the Cold War, right? Margaret Thatcher declares this is the end of history.
Right.
Francis Fukuyama declares this is the end of history. Margaret Thatcher says there is no alternative. So, that's the political framework we're in. Juan Guaido comes out of that, trained from these U.S. government-funded groups.
And he went to school in Washington, correct?
Sorry?
He went to school in Washington, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Along with many of these other leaders, Carlos Vecchio, who come. So there's this apparatus where you have Venezuelan oligarchs and their children and the elites who are from like the upper 10-15% of the population who used to govern the country before the rise of Hugo Chavez. They're the ones whose families control a lot of the companies that were importing certain kinds of food that had monopolies on the imports. So they're like a kind of parasitic bourgeoisie class, capitalist class that didn't really produce anything. They just had like monopolies, and they used to control the country. And then Hugo Chavez comes into power and kicks them all out of power. So they're looking for things to do. A lot of them go to Miami and they get involved more in politics. And you have a lot of their children become political as well. Juan Guaido, Carlos Vecchio, all of these people involved with the coup attempt come from those circles. And they have many links to Miami. They studied in the US. They went to college or grad school in the US. And Juan Guaido is one of these, right? And what happens is that they help create a party called Voluntad Popular, which is the most right-wing of the Venezuelan opposition. I mean, we don't have time to go into it, but the Venezuelan opposition is actually, it ranges the gamut from kind of center-left social democratic to really, really right-wing. And they're the most right-wing. And of course, the US government, specifically under Trump, but even under Obama, and of course under Bush, has favored this really right-wing party, one of whose senators were actually said that they wanted the Pinochet option in Venezuela. So it's very clear that they want these radical neoliberal capitalist policies, mass privatization. And Juan Guaidó, even though he's very young, he's kind of the puppet they want, because they can use him. The strategy was they'll use him as an interim president and bring in a more radical right-wing leader who is more known, like Leopoldo Lopez. And I can talk more about him, but the point is that Juan Guaidó is the kind of young face they wanted to use. And then once the coup was successful, they would replace him with someone who is from the oligarch families. But of course, the coup failed. And we can talk about why the coup failed, but it miserably failed.
Right. So you kind of touched on this like just a little bit ago, but the U.S. along with their imperialist allies depict Venezuela as an authoritarian dictatorship. But isn't it true that Venezuela surpasses the U.S. in regards to in regards to the democratic processes? If so, please elaborate.
Well, it depends on how you define it, but one of the most easiest metrics is that in its elections, Venezuela has much higher voter turnout than the U.S. does. You know, in the U.S. in the last presidential election, I believe it was 53% of eligible voters. That's not considering the millions of people who were disenfranchised, pushed out of, the voting lists. Those are, again, so it's about half of eligible voters participated. I mean, but then again, that's true for most of the world. They have higher voter turnout. The thing about Venezuela is that actually what's so interesting is that a lot of the leftist critics of Venezuela complain that the Bolivarian Revolution was never socialist enough, that there's still a mixed economy, which is very true, very true. There is absolutely a mixed economy, and there still is a very strong capitalist class that controls a lot of the economy here in Venezuela. And that is a testament to the fact, actually, that the revolution has always erred on the side of being very democratic. It's not like Cuba. In Cuba, they had a revolution. They overthrew the right-wing US-backed dictator, and then they installed a revolutionary government, but they didn't allow the capitalist class to continue controlling parts of the economy. They kicked them out, and they took their companies. Here is very different. They've always won through democratic elections. And since I mentioned 1998, in December of the election of Hugo Chavez, there have been 25 elections in Venezuela. And the Socialist Party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV, has won 23 of those 25 elections. So not all of them, but they've won most of them. And that's because the Chavista movement is so popular, because poor people and dark-skinned Venezuelans and, people who have been marginalized and left out of politics for decades, they believe in the vision of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution. Now, at the same time, what's interesting is that, like I said, there still is very much an elite that is involved in the right-wing opposition, and they're still very active. But they are the ones in the past several years who have decided not to participate in democratic processes as a way of delegitimizing the government and portraying it as a dictatorship. This is it's a simple, but it's a very deceptive strategy. It's really a strategy of saying, we refuse to recognize the legitimacy of this government, and we're not going to participate in the elections. We're going to boycott them. And then when the government continues running and having elections and wins because we boycotted them, we're going to say it's a dictatorship. That has been the strategy. And it goes back really, it's somewhat new, but it really goes back to 2017 and last year. So we saw the beginning of it under Obama. And of course, as with many presidents, especially a neoliberal like Obama, who he actually several months ago, he boasted, he said, Wall Street should be thanking me for making so much money. Obama began the seeds of the coup attempt in Venezuela. And we can talk about the sanctions and we'll get into all of that. But Trump just took it into overdrive. And what happened is in 2017, there was an election for the Constituent Assembly. And then last year, there was an election for president of Venezuela, which Maduro won again. And the right-wing opposition that is backed by the U.S. boycotted both of those elections. And then they not only did they boycott it, they also threatened the more centrist, even center-left opposition with sanctions. The U.S. threatened the centrist opposition with sanctions if they participated in the presidential election, because the Trump administration's strategy is to force all of the opposition to boycott, and then it can say that the Venezuelan government is running an election where there's really only one option. That's been the strategy, but Venezuela is still very much a democracy. And the last thing I'll say here is that, the hypocrisy is so ridiculous. I mean, the most absurd hypocrisy of all, of course, is that the U.S. has for decades supported Saudi Arabia, which is the most authoritarian country on earth, a theocratic absolute monarchy that beheads and crucifies dissidents, mostly from the Shia minority. I mean, that's the easiest hypocrisy to point out, but there's also the hypocrisy in the region, right? I mentioned earlier that I was in Honduras. Honduras has a dictatorship, basically, led by a so-called president who stole the election in 2017. Even the Organization of American States, which is very right-wing and biased and pro-U.S., even they acknowledged the election was so obviously stolen. Recently, actually, a few weeks ago, a U.S. court, a federal court in New York, named this dictator, Juan Orlando Hernandez, in Honduras as complicit in drug trafficking and using drug money to fund his rigged election campaign. So the U.S. has no problem backing these dictatorial regimes in the region. Again, the problem it has is that Venezuela has an independent, socialist-oriented government and the largest oil reserves in the world.
So, I think what a lot of our viewers and subscribers are starting to realize is that, this seems to be an ongoing problem, and the United States continues to involve itself into the affairs of numerous other sovereign countries. What do you think, since you're there on the ground and you've done a lot of reporting, will be the future of the struggle throughout South America, and what other countries are at risk for the United States getting involved and then corporate media beating the drums of war?
Well, it's a great question, and I can't tell the future, but what I can say is that we need to understand the regional shift in Latin America. Noam Chomsky made a really interesting observation, and he's right, that in the past 500 years, the only real time that Latin America has seen independent governments was really in the late 1990s and the 2000s. And in the past several years, that independence has been whittled away. So, of course, going back to 1492 and the colonization of the Americas by European powers, leading up to the progressive kind of bourgeois nationalist movements, led by people like Simón Bolívar, the Venezuelan general here in Venezuela, who is a figure that is cited by many nationalists like Hugo Chavez. This is the leader in the 1800s who fought against the Spanish Empire. And actually, last month was the 200th anniversary of him defeating the Spanish army in Colombia and liberating the northern part of South America from Spanish colonialism and building this Republic of Gran Colombia. Going back hundreds of years, there has been all of this struggle against first European colonialism and American colonialism and neocolonialism. And really, in the late 1990s and in the 2000s, you had the rise of these progressive governments that were finally these democratic governments that were acting on behalf of the majority of their population. Now, some of them were socialist oriented, but most of them were not really that radical. They were social democratic, and they were deeply democratic and believed in economic and social justice. So you have Lula da Silva in Brazil, who was from a poor family who lost one of his fingers when he was young in a work accident. And he was a leader of a major labor union. And this poor labor leader became the first serious leftist democratically elected president of Brazil ever, and was the most popular leader in Brazil's history. This is the 5th largest country on earth, massive country. And when he left office, he had an 80-something% approval rating, unheard of. And he believed in using Brazil's wealth, its natural resources, and its people, its labor force, not to benefit external corporations, but to build up the country and fight poverty. And there were so many other leaders throughout the region. And in the past several years, many of these leaders have been overthrown and pushed back. It was called the pink tide. And like I said, it was really the first time in 500 years that Latin America was independent. You had progressive governments in Ecuador, which now is as a neoliberal US-backed government. In Paraguay, which had a soft coup backed by the US. In Honduras, had a progressive nationalist government overthrown in a US-backed military coup. You had in Chile and Argentina, progressive governments that lost the elections for a variety of reasons. And now, though, the struggle is rising against the right-wing regimes, which have been so discredited because, all they're doing is increasing debt, taking massive IMF loans, privatizing social services. So in fact, we just saw in Argentina a major electoral victory in the first round of elections for the progressives in Argentina. So it's hard to say what the future will be, but what we can say from the past 20 years is that there was this pink tide of these progressive movements that looked not just to Venezuela, but looked to Brazil and other countries in the region as beacons of progressive economic and social change. And I think in the next 20 and 30 years, the struggle is going to be to bring back these progressive governments. And the recent election in Argentina, for many people here in Venezuela and in other countries, people I talk to, that was a real ray of hope, of light in this darkness, because it shows that we have a fascist government, an actual fascist government in Brazil, led by someone who makes Trump look like a moderate, Jair Bolsonaro, very extreme.
Yeah.
And you have so many other right-wing governments that finally it looks like the left might be once again ascendant.
But we can only hope, and unfortunately we are running out of time. This is a very in-depth topic, so we would love to have you on again very soon.
Yeah, so reach out to us. We'd like to do a few more follow-ups, and should you ever come to the city of Chicago, we'd like to have you in the studio as well.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. So to wrap it up, where can our viewers and subscribers learn more about you and find your work on social media?
Absolutely. Like I mentioned, I help edit this website, The Grayzone. You can find that at thegrayzone.com with an A in gray. And you can find me on Twitter. And I'll say I'm still here reporting on something that is not getting any media attention, which is the U.S. embargo that Donald Trump declared on August 5th. And of course, the sanctions going back. So thank you so much for giving journalists like me a platform to talk about these issues that are ignored by mainstream media. People in the U.S. need to understand, and Europe, that their governments are waging an economic war. That, the government here, people are not starving. The government is providing social services, but there are major economic difficulties. And the U.S. strategy is very clearly, in fact, the Trump administration officials said it. They want to use the stranglehold of Darth Vader. Right. That is the language he used on the neck of the Venezuelan economy. And it's not just Venezuela, it's the Iranian economy and other countries that are trying to pursue an independent path of economic and political development. So people in the U.S. need to understand that, unfortunately, the U.S., our tax dollars go to funding this starvation program to try to really wage economic war on the collective population of countries like Venezuela. And it's important for alternative media outlets to talk about that, and of course progressive leaders and politicians to speak out. So it's also important to pressure people like Bernie Sanders and others who have been speaking out a bit, but to talk more about what's going on.
Now, that's a perfect note to end it on. Ben Norton, all the best to you. You once again proved that independent media can do the job. Independent journalists can do the job that corporate neoliberal establishment media will not do. And it's something that all of us around the world need to support. I think now more than ever, we need independent media, independent journalists to cover stories that corporate media will not cover. We invite you to come back onto the show. Otherwise, peace. Take care, and let's all do what we can to build a better future.